After a successful business trip, a millionaire returns home eager. He can't wait to see his daughter, but upon arriving, he finds a shocking scene. His young daughter is being handcuffed and taken away by police inside his home. He soon discovers that his wife was behind a plan to take the girl from him. If this beautiful story of overcoming adversity and love interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The flight landed at O'Hare International Airport punctually at 6:43 in the morning. Edward Morrison disembarked with the typical exhaustion of someone who had spent the last 16 hours between one plane and another, crossing oceans and time zones that seemed never-ending. His designer luggage carried more than just clothes and documents. It carried the certainty that this trip had been a watershed moment in his career. The DIDN contracts signed in Dubai and Singapore represented the definitive consolidation of his empire in the hospital technology sector. State-of-the-art equipment, strategic partnerships with world-renowned hospitals, and multi-million-dollar investments would elevate his company, MedTech Solutions, to another level. Everything had gone according to plan, better than planned, in fact. As he walked through the terminal, Edward felt that quiet satisfaction of someone who has completed an important mission. At 42, he had built an empire from scratch. The son of a small shopkeeper from rural Illinois, he had grown up watching his father struggle to pay the bills, to educate his children, to maintain dignity even when money was scarce. That humble origin never left his memory. On the contrary, it was the fuel that drove him to go further, to never settle for enough, to always strive for more. But the most important thing, he thought as he quickened his pace towards the exit, wasn't the money itself. It was what money could provide: security, comfort, opportunities, and above all, the ability to give his daughter everything he never had. Isabel. The girl's name surfaced in his mind as it always did, bringing with it a wave of tenderness that soothed any fatigue. His little Isabel, only 8 years old, was the center of his universe. Since Marianne passed away 3 years ago, the girl had become even more precious to him. Marianne's departure had been devastating. A blow of fate that no money, no connection, no power could prevent. She simply fell ill, wasting away in a matter of months, leaving behind a void that Edward found impossible to fill. For the first 2 years, he and Isabel lived in a kind of trance, trying to find a new balance, a new way of existing without the luminous presence that had been Marianne. That's when Veronica appeared. Veronica Sellers, elegant, sophisticated, with that delicate smile that seemed to bring comfort in the most difficult moments. She entered his life at a charity event, a gala for medical research, where they talked about loss, about new beginnings, about the difficulty of moving forward when everything seems to have fallen apart. Veronica was also a widow. She also knew the pain of absence. She also had stories of sleepless nights and hidden tears. There was an immediate connection, not romantic at first, but human, genuine, as if they were two, wounded souls recognizing the same scar in each other. Over time, that friendship transformed into something more. Veronica began to visit the Morrison house, initially for quiet dinners, then for entire weekends. Isabel seemed to like her, or at least that's what Edward believed. The girl showed no rejection, accepting the new woman's presence in their lives with the characteristic pliability of children who are still trying to understand the adult world. And Edward, thirsty for some form of normality, for someone who could share the weight of his loneliness, allowed himself to believe that it could work. He allowed himself to imagine that Isabel would have a mother figure again, that he would have a partner, that the house would no longer echo with the deafening silence of absence. The wedding took place just 6 months ago, a discreet ceremony, only close friends and family, in the garden of their mansion in Highland Park. Veronica wore a cream-colored dress, elegant and sober, nothing that could be interpreted as disrespectful to Marianne's memory. Isabel was the flower girl, in a little pink dress and a crown of flowers in her brown hair. The girl smiled throughout the ceremony, and Edward interpreted that as approval, as acceptance. He wanted so badly to believe he was doing the right thing, that he was rebuilding his family, that he didn't allow any doubt to assail him. Now, leaving the airport and getting into the car waiting for him, Edward felt only an eagerness to get home. 15 days away had been far too long. Video calls weren't enough to quell his longing for Isabel, to hear her laughter, to see her eyes sparkle as she told him about something she learned at school. He had promised her he would return with gifts, with stories, with all the attention she deserved. And now, finally, he was on his way. The driver, Walter, a middle-aged man who had worked for the family for over 10 years, greeted Edward with his usual discreet manner. "Mr. Morrison, welcome back. Was it a good trip?" Edward replied affirmatively, but soon noticed something strange in Walter's expression. There was a tension there, a hesitation that was not typical. The driver seemed to want to say something but held back, as if he didn't know exactly where to begin. Edward asked if everything was all right, if something had happened at home during his absence. Walter hesitated again, then simply said, "It would be better if you saw for yourself when you arrive, sir." That answer brought no comfort at all. On the contrary, it planted a seed of unease that began to grow as the car crossed the city. Chicago's morning traffic was chaotic as always, but Edward barely paid attention. His mind was now focused on the possibilities. Had something happened to Isabel? A problem at school? An illness? But if it were something serious, Veronica would have called, would have told him. In their last phone conversations, she had seemed normal, calm, saying everything was under control, that Isabel was fine, that there was no reason to worry. Edward tried to calm himself. It was probably just some minor issue, something related to the house, something Walter had overreacted to. But when the car finally entered the gated community in Highland Park and approached the mansion, Edward saw something that made his heart pound. There were 2 police cars parked in front of the gate. They weren't unmarked cars. They were official patrol cars, their lights off but their presence unmistakable. Edward felt his stomach churn. Something was very wrong. He ordered Walter to speed up, and the car moved through the already open automatic gate, up the cobblestone driveway that led to the main entrance of the house. Before the vehicle came to a complete stop, Edward had already opened the door and jumped out. His legs were trembling slightly, not from fatigue, but from an anxiety that was beginning to turn into panic. He ran towards the entrance of the house, where the main door was wide open. Upon entering the spacious hall with its Italian marble floor and imported crystal chandelier, Edward was confronted with a scene he never imagined seeing in his own home. There were 4 police officers inside his house, 2 men and 2 women, all in uniform, with that rigid posture characteristic of authority. And in the center of that small group, holding the hand of one of the female officers, was Isabel. The girl was wearing her unicorn pajamas, the ones she loved most, and her feet were bare. Her eyes were red and swollen, as if she had been crying a lot. And what made Edward's heart nearly stop was what he saw on his daughter's delicate wrists. Handcuffs. Child-sized handcuffs. The kind used in exceptional cases, but handcuffs nonetheless. His 8-year-old daughter was handcuffed inside her own home, being escorted by police officers as if she were a criminal. Edward felt every possible emotion rush through his chest at once. Confusion, anger, fear, disbelief. He lunged towards the officers, demanding to know what was happening, why his daughter was being treated this way, who had authorized this. His voice came out louder than he intended, laden with desperation and outrage. The officers positioned themselves defensively, one of them raising a hand in a restraining gesture, asking for calm, saying there was a court order, that they were just doing their duty. That's when Veronica appeared. She descended the stairs with a disconcerting calm, wearing a beige silk robe, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at that hour of the morning. Her face showed none of the anguish that would be expected of a stepmother seeing a child being taken by the police. There was something closer to satisfaction, to relief, as if what was happening was exactly what she had expected. She greeted Edward with a simple hello, without emotion, without urgency, as if she were just commenting on the weather. Edward turned to her, demanding an explanation. Veronica sighed as if dealing with something tedious and began to speak in that soft voice he knew so well. She explained that she had noticed worrying behaviors in Isabel over the past few weeks. High fevers during the night, seizure-like episodes, fainting spells. According to Veronica, the girl was clearly ill, but Edward, being always traveling, always absent, had never noticed the gravity of the situation. She said she had taken Isabel to several doctors, that they had all recommended immediate admission to a specialized clinic, that the situation was delicate and required urgent care. The court order, according to Veronica, was just a necessary formality to ensure Isabel received the proper treatment, since Edward was not present to authorize it. Edward looked at Isabel. The girl stared at him with those brown eyes that were so much like Marianne's, and in that gaze there was only one thing: fear. Pure and absolute fear. Isabel was not sick. Edward knew his daughter. He knew every expression, every gesture, every nuance of her personality. And what he saw now was not a sick child. It was a terrified child. Isabel tried to speak, tried to say something, but one of the officers gently pulled her back, saying it was better for her to be quiet, that everything would be fine, that they just wanted to help her. Edward felt reality disintegrating around him. This made no sense. High fevers, seizures, fainting. Isabel had never shown any of these symptoms. He talked to her every day on video call, and the girl always seemed perfectly healthy, playful, talkative, full of energy. How could she be so sick as to need immediate hospitalization? Edward demanded to see the medical reports, the nice documents that justified this absurd court order. Veronica, with that infuriating calm, said that all the papers were in order, that she had arranged everything, that he didn't need to worry because they were doing what was best for Isabel. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a grey mustache, approached Edward and handed him a copy of the court order. Edward took the paper with trembling hands and began to read. The words danced before his eyes. Order for involuntary commitment. Risk to physical integrity. Severe clinical condition. Need for immediate intervention. Authorized by legal guardian, Veronica Sellers, Morrison. Edward couldn't believe what he was reading. How had Veronica managed this? How had a judge signed such an order without him, the biological father being consulted? Isabel began to cry again, calling out for him. "Daddy, please don't let them take me. I'm not sick, Daddy. I swear I'm not sick." She tried to pull away from the officer's hand, but was held firmly. Edward took a step towards his daughter, but was blocked by two officers. One of them explained that interfering with the execution of a court order was a crime, that he could be arrested, if he insisted that the best thing to do was to let them proceed. Edward felt completely powerless. Here he was, a powerful man, owner of a considerable fortune, with connections all over the country, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop his daughter from being taken away. Veronica watched everything with a serene expression. She approached Edward and placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that should have been comforting, but only caused revulsion. She said she understood how difficult this was for him, that she was also suffering with the situation, but that it was necessary to think of Isabel's well-being. The clinic where the girl was being taken was one of the best in the country, with highly qualified professionals, and there she would receive all the necessary care to recover. Edward jerked his arm away, rejecting the touch. He asked which clinic, where it was, when he could visit Isabel. Veronica replied that all those details would be provided later, that for now the important thing was to let the professionals do their work. The officers began to lead Isabel towards the door. The girl struggled, crying, screaming for her father. Edward felt something break inside him. He tried to move forward again, but was restrained once more. His voice came out hoarse, almost pleading. "Isabel, Daddy will fix this, I promise. I'm coming to get you, don't be afraid." The girl was placed inside one of the patrol cars, and Edward saw her small face pressed against the window, tears streaming uncontrollably. And then the car drove away, taking with it the only thing that truly mattered in his life. The silence that followed was absolute. Edward stood frozen in the hall, staring at the open door, unable to fully process what had just happened. Walter had come inside and was watching the scene with a look of deep sorrow. The other officers were still there, finishing some paperwork, speaking among themselves in low voices. And Veronica simply went back up the stairs, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, as if she hadn't just destroyed a man's world. Edward felt his legs weaken. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath, trying to put his thoughts in order. Something was profoundly wrong here. Isabel was not sick, he was absolutely certain of it. So why had Veronica done this? Why had she mobilized doctors, judges, and police to take a healthy child from her home? What kind of motive could lie behind something so cruel? The pieces began to fall into place slowly in his mind, forming a picture he didn't want to accept, but which was becoming increasingly clear. Veronica was not who he thought she was. The woman he had welcomed into his home, whom he had accepted as his wife, whom he had trusted to care for his daughter, was hiding something. And whatever it was big enough for her to be willing to do something so extreme. Edward straightened up. The initial shock was beginning to give way to something different: determination, anger, a visceral need to protect his daughter and uncover the truth. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Marcia. Dr. Marcia Thorne had been his lawyer for over 15 years, a brilliant woman who had saved his company from countless lawsuits and legal complications. If anyone could help him now, it was her. Marcia answered on the third ring. Her sleepy voice indicated she hadn't fully woken up yet. Edward didn't apologize for the hour. He simply started talking, quickly explaining what had happened, his voice breaking at times due to the restrained emotion. Marcia listened in silence, and when he finished, she simply told him not to do anything else, not to talk to anyone else, and to wait for her. She would be there in less than an hour. Her tone had changed completely. There was no more sleep in her voice. There was concern and, more importantly, there was urgency. Edward hung up and looked around. The house that was supposed to be a refuge, a place of comfort and security, now felt hostile, laden with secrets and lies. Veronica was somewhere upstairs, probably in her room, probably satisfied with what she had accomplished. Edward felt a deep hatred growing inside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. Acting on impulse would do no good. He needed to be strategic, precise, relentless. He needed to find out exactly what Veronica was planning and how he could reverse it. He went up the stairs slowly, each step feeling like it weighed a ton. Upon reaching the second floor, he went to the room Veronica occupied, formerly the room that had been his and Marianne's. He knocked on the door hard. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Finally, Veronica's voice came from inside, calm and controlled. "Come in, Edward." He opened the door. Veronica was sitting on the bed, flipping through a design magazine as if it were just another ordinary day. She looked up at him and smiled slightly. That smile, which once seemed warm, now revealed itself for what it truly was: cold, calculated, devoid of any genuine emotion. Edward closed the door behind him and advanced towards her, keeping a safe distance but making it clear through his posture that he was furious. He demanded that she explain everything, that she tell him the truth about why she had done this to Isabel, that she tell him what game she was playing. Veronica put the magazine aside and sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. She said there was no game, that she was just doing what was necessary to protect Isabel. Edward retorted that Isabel didn't need protection, that she was perfectly healthy, until he left on his trip. Veronica smiled again, in that way that made Edward's blood boil. She then said something that caught him completely off guard. "Edward, you're an intelligent man. You've built an empire. But sometimes it's surprising how intelligent men can be so blind to what's happening right under their noses. Do you really think I would do all this without a very good reason? Do you really think I got that court order without solid proof?" Edward felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the way she spoke, an absolute confidence, that made him realize he was dealing with something much more complex than he had imagined. Veronica got up from the bed and walked to the window, her back to him. She said Edward should stop trying to interfere, that it would be better for everyone if he simply accepted the situation and trusted that she knew what she was doing. Edward asked where Isabel was being taken. Veronica replied that it was to a safe place where she would receive the proper care. Edward insisted, demanding the name of the clinic, the address. Veronica turned to him, and for the first time since he had arrived home, her face showed a different expression. It wasn't anger or coldness. It was something closer to triumphant satisfaction. She said he would receive all the information when the time was right. For now it would be better for him to rest from his trip, compose himself, and wait. Edward felt helplessness wash over him again. He was in his own house, in front of his own wife, and he couldn't get a straight answer about his daughter's whereabouts. He took a step towards Veronica, his voice low but laced with threat. "If you've done anything to hurt my daughter, I swear I will destroy you." Veronica was unfazed. She simply smiled and said he should be more careful with his words, that threats could be interpreted in dangerous ways, especially coming from a man who was about to be investigated for parental neglect. Edward felt the floor open up beneath his feet. Parental neglect? What was she talking about? Veronica explained, still with that infuriating calm, that the medical reports not only attested to Isabel's illness, but also indicated that the symptoms had been ignored for months. That there were records of consultations in which she, Veronica, had tried to warn him about the girl's condition, but that he, always too busy with his business, always traveling, always absent, never paid proper attention. Edward knew this was a lie, a complete and utter lie, but he realized with growing horror that Veronica had constructed an entire narrative with documents, witnesses, and fabricated evidence to support that accusation. He took a few steps back, his mind working frantically. This was much bigger than he had imagined. Veronica wasn't just trying to commit Isabel, she was building a case against him. She was trying to destroy his reputation, separate him from his daughter, and probably, though he wasn't yet sure how, take control of his fortune. He needed to act fast. He needed help. He needed to gather his own evidence before it was too late. Edward left the room without another word. He went down the stairs quickly and headed straight for his office on the first floor. It was a spacious room with fine wood shelves filled with books and documents, an imposing executive desk, and large windows overlooking the backyard garden. He locked the door behind him and began to go through his files. He needed to find all the documents related to the marriage, the powers of attorney he had signed, the assets that were in their joint names. He needed to understand the exact legal extent of Veronica's power over his life and over Isabel. As he searched, his mind kept returning to the terrified face of his daughter being taken away by the police. That image would be impossible to erase, and the promise he had made to Isabel, that he would come for her, that he would fix everything, echoed in his mind like a sacred oath. He didn't know how yet. He didn't know how long it would take, but one thing was absolutely clear: he was going to find out the truth. He was going to expose Veronica, and he was going to get his daughter back, even if it cost him everything he had built. Dr. Marcia Thorne arrived exactly 47 minutes after Edward's call. She parked her black sedan at the mansion's entrance and got out of the car with the characteristic determination of someone about to enter a battle. Marcia was 51, with black hair cut in a modern bob, and a presence that intimidated even the most experienced opponents in court. She carried a brown leather briefcase under her arm and wore a navy blue suit that conveyed seriousness and competence. When Walter opened the door for her, Marcia entered the house with firm steps, her dark eyes already scanning the environment for any detail that might be relevant. Edward was waiting for her in the office. He had spent the last hour trying to organize documents, making frantic notes about everything that had happened, trying to remember every detail of the weeks leading up to his trip. When Marcia entered the office, he stood up immediately. She closed the door behind her and, before even greeting him formally, got straight to the point. "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small it seems." Edward began to narrate the events of that morning, but Marcia interrupted him. "No, Edward. From the beginning. From when you met Veronica. What your relationship was like. How she behaved with Isabel, everything." He understood what she wanted. Context. Marcia always said that the seemingly insignificant details were often the ones that revealed the truth. So Edward went back in time to almost 2 years ago, when he had met Veronica at that charity event. He described their first meetings, the conversations about loss and new beginnings, how Veronica had shown herself to be understanding and patient, never forcing an approach, always respecting his and Isabel's space. He told her how she started visiting the house more regularly, how she cooked delicious dinners, how she talked to Isabel about school and cartoons, how she seemed genuinely interested in building a bond with the girl. Edward admitted that, at the time, he was so desperate for some normality, for someone to fill the void left by Marianne, that he might not have paid attention to signs that now in retrospect seemed obvious. Marcia took quick notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking pointed questions. Did Isabel genuinely like her, or did she just tolerate her? Edward hesitated. Honestly, I'm not sure. Isabel never complained openly, but she also never showed the kind of enthusiasm I would expect from a child gaining a new mother figure. There was a polite cordiality, perhaps even a bit forced, but I interpreted that as natural. After all, no child would easily replace their biological mother. I thought it was just a matter of time before Isabel opened up to Veronica completely. Marcia asked about the wedding. How was it decided? Who proposed? What kind of property division was chosen? Edward explained that the idea of marriage had come up naturally after almost a year of dating. Veronica never pushed. In fact, it was he who brought up the subject, thinking it would be good for Isabel to have more stability, to be sure that Veronica wouldn't disappear from their lives like so many other people had. As for the property regime, Edward admitted he hadn't paid much attention to the details. Veronica suggested community property, the standard in Illinois, and he agreed without question. After all, he had more than enough wealth, and it never crossed his mind that Veronica could have ulterior motives. Marcia stopped writing and looked up at him. Edward, did you sign any power of attorney for her? Any document that gave her decision-making power over your assets or over Isabel? Edward felt a chill run down his spine. Yes, he had. Shortly after the wedding, Veronica had mentioned it would be practical if she had a power of attorney to handle bureaucratic matters if he was traveling. Edward traveled frequently, and it seemed to make sense. He had signed the document without reading it carefully, trusting it was just an administrative formality. Marcia closed her eyes for a moment, clearly frustrated. She asked to see the document immediately. Edward went to the file where he kept his personal papers and searched for the power of attorney. When he finally found it and handed it to Marcia, she read it in silence, and Edward could see her expression growing increasingly tense. When she finished, she placed the paper on the desk and sighed deeply. Edward, this isn't a simple administrative power of attorney. This is a broad and irrevocable power of attorney. She has the power to make decisions about all your assets, your companies, your bank accounts. And even worse, she has the legal power to make decisions about Isabel in your absence. Edward felt the world spin around him. How had he been so stupid? How had he signed something like this without reading it carefully? Marcia continued, her voice now softer but still firm. This explains how she got the court order to commit Isabel. Legally, she has the right to make medical decisions for the child when you are not present. And if she presented medical reports, even if they were fake, a judge would have no reason to question it. Edward buried his face in his hands. He had handed his daughter and his fortune on a silver platter to a woman he barely knew. Marcia didn't waste time with recriminations. She was a professional, and she knew the important thing now was to act, not to lament. She said they needed 3 things immediately. First, to find out where Isabel was. Second, to get copies of all the medical reports Veronica had presented to obtain the court order. Third, to start gathering evidence that Isabel was healthy before the supposed illness. Edward agreed, but asked how they would find out where Isabel was if Veronica refused to say. Marcia smiled for the first time since she had arrived. She said she had contacts in the judiciary, that she could officially request a copy of the court file, and that it would contain the name and address of the clinic. While Marcia made some calls, Edward took the opportunity to check his emails and messages. There were dozens of work emails that he completely ignored. His attention was captured by a message from an unknown number. The text was short and direct. Mr. Morrison, my name is Brenda Alcott. I'm an investigative journalist. I need to speak with you urgently about your wife. I have information that may be relevant. Edward showed the message to Marcia. She frowned. It could be a trap, but it could also be a valuable source. She said Edward should reply, but cautiously, and arranged to meet in a public place. Edward replied to the message, asking Brenda to explain what it was about. The response came almost immediately. In person. This afternoon, if possible. There's a cafe on Michigan Avenue, the Astor Cafe, 3 o'clock. Edward agreed. Marcia said she would go with him, that it wasn't wise for him to go to such a meeting alone. She then went back to making calls, talking to judges, prosecutors, and fellow lawyers, trying to expedite the process of obtaining the official documents related to Isabel's commitment. Meanwhile, Edward decided to do something he had been putting off. He needed to talk to someone who really knew Isabel, someone who could testify about the girl's state of health. He called Isabel's school, Harmony Academy, an elite institution in Highland Park. He asked to speak with the head of student affairs, Ms. Lucy Andrews, a middle-aged woman who had known Isabel since kindergarten. When Lucy answered, Edward introduced himself and asked if she had noticed anything different about Isabel in recent weeks, any sign of illness or discomfort. Lucy was surprised by the question. She said Isabel was perfectly fine. She was participative in class, played normally during recess, and was eating properly. There were no records of visits to the nurse's office, no complaints of pain or discomfort, no incidents that indicated any health problems. Edward felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief because it confirmed that Isabel was the victim of a sham. Anger because Veronica had lied shamelessly about the girl's health. He thanked Lucy and asked her to formalize that information in writing, explaining that there was a legal situation underway. Lucy, concerned, said she would do so immediately, and that the school was at their disposal to help Isabel in any way. Marcia finished her calls and reported that she had managed to speed up the process. In a few hours, they would have access to the complete court file. She had also discovered through her contacts that the judge who signed the order was Judge Henry Foster, a magistrate with a controversial reputation. There were rumors, never proven, that he had connections to certain private clinics, that he received bribes to facilitate involuntary commitments. Marcia made it clear that these were just rumors, but that it was worth investigating. If they could prove corruption was involved, they could not only annul Isabel's commitment, but also create a scandal that would seriously damage Veronica. While they waited for the meeting with the journalist, Edward and Marcia reviewed all the documents they had on hand. The power of attorney Edward had signed was indeed far too broad. Marcia explained that it would be possible to revoke it, but that it would take time, require a legal process, and in the meantime, Veronica would still have the legal power the document granted her. The ideal scenario would be to prove that she had obtained the power of attorney fraudulently, that she had deceived Edward about the extent of the powers he was granting, but that would be difficult to prove. The signature was his, notarized, and there were no witnesses to the fact that he had been misled. Edward asked about the possibility of accusing Veronica of forging the medical reports. Marcia said yes, that was possible, and likely the most effective path. If they could prove the reports were false, that the doctors who signed them either didn't exist or were bribed, they would have a solid case not only to get Isabel back but also to prosecute Veronica criminally. But they needed concrete evidence. They needed the original reports. They needed to investigate the doctors who signed them. They needed to build a case that was irrefutable. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Edward and Marcia left the mansion. Walter drove them to Chicago in respectful silence. During the drive, Edward looked out the window without really seeing the landscape. His mind was constantly returning to Isabel. Where was she at that moment? Was she scared? Was she being treated well? Did they understand that she wasn't sick? Or were they subjecting her to unnecessary, potentially harmful tests and treatments? The mere thought of his daughter suffering because of this farce made Edward feel a rage so intense he had to struggle to breathe. They arrived at the Astor Cafe 15 minutes before the scheduled time. It was a traditional establishment on Michigan Avenue, with marble-topped tables and an Art Deco charm that attracted both tourists and Chicagoans. Edward and Marcia chose a table in the back, from where they could watch the entrance. They ordered coffee and waited. Exactly at 3 o'clock, a woman entered the cafe. She was young, probably in her early 30s, with brown hair tied in a ponytail and square-framed glasses. She looked around, located Edward, whom she had likely recognized from photos online, and walked towards their table. Brenda Alcott introduced herself and shook hands with Edward and Marcia. She seemed nervous, but determined. She ordered a tea and got straight to the point. "Mr. Morrison, I know you don't know me and have no reason to trust me, but you need to hear what I have to say. I've been investigating your wife for a few months." Edward felt his stomach clench. Why would a journalist be investigating Veronica? Brenda explained that it all started when she was working on a story about fraud in involuntary commitments. During her research, Veronica Seller's name came up several times, always peripherally, never as the main subject but always present. Brenda opened her bag and took out a folder with documents. She spread some papers on the table. "Veronica Sellers is not actually a widow, Mr. Morrison. She's divorced, and her ex-husband, a businessman from Milwaukee named Robert Fisher, went through a situation very similar to yours." Edward and Marcia exchanged tense glances. Brenda continued. "Robert had a son from a previous marriage. When he married Veronica, she gradually began to isolate the boy, claiming he had behavioral problems that required treatment. She managed to have him committed to a psychiatric clinic under false allegations. Meanwhile, she manipulated Robert into signing powers of attorney and transferring assets into her name. By the time Robert finally realized what was happening and tried to fight back, it was too late. He was bankrupt with no access to his own assets, and his son had been declared incompetent by the clinic's doctors. Edward felt nauseous. This was exactly what was happening to him and Isabel. Veronica was repeating a pattern. Marcia asked what had happened to Robert. Brenda lowered her eyes. "He tried to fight in court, but he couldn't prove anything. The clinic's doctors presented convincing reports. There were documents signed by him agreeing to everything, and Veronica had excellent lawyers. Robert lost everything. The last time I spoke with him, he was living in a rented apartment, working as a freelance consultant, trying to save money to keep paying lawyers. His son is still in the clinic. It's been 4 years. Edward felt a wave of panic. Could this be Isabel's future? 4 years committed to a clinic, separated from him, subjected to unnecessary treatments? He would not allow that to happen, no matter the cost. Marcia, ever practical, asked Brenda if she had documented proof of all this. The journalist confirmed. She had interviewed Robert extensively, had copies of court files, had spoken with neighbors and acquaintances who witnessed the change in Veronica's behavior throughout the marriage. But she had never been able to publish the story because she lacked conclusive proof that Veronica had acted criminally. Everything was too well constructed, too well documented legally. It was almost impossible to prove fraud. Edward asked why Brenda was helping. The journalist smiled sadly. "Because it's infuriating to see someone destroy families like this and get away with it. And because when I heard Veronica had remarried, I tried to warn you. I sent anonymous messages, tried to contact people close to you, but I never got through. And now, seeing on the news that a child was involuntarily committed, that her name is Isabel Morrison, I knew Veronica was doing it again." Edward felt both gratitude and shame. Gratitude because Brenda was trying to help. Shame because if he had paid more attention, if he had been less naive, he might have been able to prevent all of this. Marcia asked to keep the documents Brenda had brought. The journalist agreed and handed over the entire folder. She also gave them her card with her phone number and email, saying she was available to help in any way necessary. Edward thanked her sincerely. Brenda stood up to leave, but before she went, she looked directly into Edward's eyes. "Mr. Morrison, you have advantages that Robert didn't have. You have more resources, more connections, more power. Use them. Fight for your daughter with everything you have, because Veronica will not give up easily. She is methodical, patient, and extremely dangerous." With those words, Brenda left the cafe, leaving Edward and Marcia to absorb all the information. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Marcia flipped through the documents Brenda had given them, making notes. Edward drank his now cold coffee, trying to process everything. Veronica wasn't just an opportunistic con artist. She was something much worse. She was a calculating predator who chose her victims carefully. Widowed or divorced men, with children with considerable assets. She would infiltrate their lives, gain their trust, and then, when all the pieces were in place, she would strike. And the most frightening part was her patience. She had been with him for almost 2 years. 2 years building a facade, waiting for the right moment. Edward's trip to Dubai and Singapore had been that moment. With him out of the country, she could act without him being able to interfere immediately. Marcia finally spoke. "Edward, this changes everything. We now have a pattern of behavior. We can use Robert's case to show that Veronica is a serial criminal. But we need to be careful. If she finds out we have this information, she might accelerate her plans, try to consolidate control over your assets before you can react. We need to act fast, but also intelligently." Edward agreed. He asked what the next step was. Marcia said first they needed the court file on Isabel's commitment. Then they needed to locate the clinic and, if possible, get Isabel out legally. Simultaneously, they needed to start gathering evidence against Veronica, contact Robert Fisher to see if he would be willing to testify, and investigate the doctors who signed the false reports. They returned to the mansion with a plan, but when they arrived, they found something unexpected. A strange car was parked in front of the house, a grey, unmarked sedan. When they entered, they found Veronica in the living room, sitting comfortably on the sofa, talking with 2 men in suits. One was older, with grey hair and an authoritative posture. The other was younger, thin, with slim glasses. When Edward and Marcia entered, the conversation stopped immediately. Veronica smiled and stood up. She introduced the men. The older one was Dr. Arnold Campos, the director of the clinic where Isabel was being held. The younger one was Dr. Philip Moore, the psychiatrist responsible for Isabel's case. Edward felt rage explode inside him, but Marcia discreetly touched his arm, a silent warning to maintain his composure. Dr. Campos began to speak, his voice slow and professorial. "Mr. Morrison, I understand this situation is difficult for you, but I want to assure you that your daughter is receiving the best care. The Renaissance Clinic is one of the most respected institutions in the country for the treatment of childhood neuropsychiatric disorders." Edward interrupted. "My daughter does not have neuropsychiatric disorders. She is perfectly healthy." Dr. Moore intervened, his voice soft but firm. "Mr. Morrison, it's understandable that as a father you have difficulty accepting the diagnosis. Many parents go through denial when they discover their children have health problems, but the tests were conclusive. Isabel shows signs of a severe dissociative disorder, in addition to recurrent convulsive episodes. Treatment is necessary and urgent." Edward wanted to punch the man. How dare he say that, knowing it was a lie? Marcia took control of the situation. She formally introduced herself as Edward's lawyer and demanded to see the original medical reports and the results of the tests that had supposedly been performed on Isabel. Dr. Campos exchanged a quick glance with Veronica. He then said that the documents were confidential, protected by medical privacy laws, and could only be shared with a court order. Marcia smiled coldly. "Excellent. I will arrange for that court order today, and in the meantime, I demand that Isabel undergo a second medical evaluation, with professionals of my choosing." Dr. Moore replied that this would not be possible, that interrupting treatment midstream could be detrimental to the child, that a third-party evaluation would only be a waste of time that would delay Isabel's recovery. Marcia was not intimidated. "That was not a request, doctor. It was a formal notification. I will be filing for a court order today, and I suggest the clinic cooperates unless you want to face a full investigation into your medical practices." The atmosphere became tense. Dr. Campos stood up, clearly annoyed. He said he would not accept threats, that the clinic's procedures were all in order, that there was nothing wrong with their practices. Marcia retorted that then there would be no problem in submitting to an external audit. Dr. Campos and Dr. Moore said a cold goodbye and left the house. Veronica remained seated, watching everything with that calm expression Edward now recognized as pure manipulation. When the doctors left, she finally spoke. "You're making a mistake. You're putting Isabel at risk by questioning her treatment." Edward took a step towards her. "The only person who put Isabel at risk was you. Veronica sighed and stood up. "Edward, you still don't understand. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how many lawyers you hire. You've already lost. I have all the legal power over Isabel. I have full access to your assets. You signed everything." With those words, she calmly walked up the stairs, leaving Edward and Marcia alone in the room. The early morning hours found Edward awake in his office, surrounded by piles of documents and a cold cup of coffee. He hadn't been able to sleep for a minute. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Isabel's face being led away by the police, heard her cries for help. Guilt consumed him. As a father, as a protector, he had failed in the worst possible way. He had let a stranger into his house, had given her power over his daughter, and now Isabel was paying the price for his naivety. But guilt, as corrosive as it was, could not paralyze him. He had to turn it into fuel, into relentless determination to reverse this situation. Marcia had also worked through the night. Around 5 in the morning, she called Edward. Her voice sounded tired but triumphant. "I got it. I have the complete copy of the court file, and I found out where Isabel is." Edward's heart raced. The Renaissance Clinic was in Lake Forest, on the outskirts of Chicago, a private establishment that specialized, according to its institutional website, in the treatment of neuropsychiatric disorders in children and adolescents. Marcia said she would go there that morning with a team of social workers and a court officer to check on the conditions in which Isabel was being held. Edward said he would go with her, but Marcia dissuaded him. It would be better if he didn't show up initially. His presence could be interpreted as an attempt at coercion, and that would harm the legal process. She promised to call as soon as she had any information about Isabel's condition. While he waited, Edward decided to review the documents Brenda had left with them. The case of Robert Fisher was frighteningly similar to his own. Veronica had entered Robert's life just over a year after his separation. His son, Matthew, was 9 at the time. Veronica gradually won Robert's trust, always appearing affectionate and attentive, but at the same time, she began to plant seeds of doubt about Matthew's behavior. She said the boy was aggressive, had difficulties in school, that maybe he needed psychological help. Robert, who was dealing with his own post-divorce emotional crisis and the demands of work, began to believe that maybe Veronica was right, that maybe he was blind to his son's problems. What followed was a methodical escalation. Veronica took Matthew to psychologists and psychiatrists who somehow always confirmed her suspicions. The boy received increasingly severe diagnoses: conduct disorder, aggressive tendencies, a risk to himself and others. Robert, scared and confused, followed the medical recommendations until the involuntary commitment came. Matthew was taken to a clinic initially for 15 days, which turned into 30, then 90, then indefinitely. And all the while, Robert signed papers, transferred assets, gave powers of attorney, all under Veronica's guidance, who claimed she was just trying to protect the family's assets while he dealt with his son's crisis. By the time Robert finally realized he had been deceived, it was too late. He no longer had access to his own bank account. His properties had been sold. His company was in the name of third parties controlled by Veronica. And Matthew, whom he discovered was perfectly healthy, was trapped in a psychiatric clinic under false allegations, but with impeccable legal documentation. Robert tried to fight, hired lawyers, but every attempt was blocked by medical reports, notarized signatures, and court orders. He was fighting a system that Veronica had masterfully manipulated. Edward felt a painful identification with Robert. They were successful, intelligent men, accustomed to controlling situations, but who had been completely deceived by a woman who perfectly understood their vulnerabilities. Veronica wasn't just a common con artist. She was an extremely skilled psychological manipulator. She knew exactly what kind of man to look for: recent widowers or divorcees, still emotionally fragile, with children, preferably young ones, easier to control through the mental health system, with significant assets. And always, she acted with patience, building her traps slowly, brick by brick, until there was no way out. Around 8 in the morning, Edward heard movement upstairs. Veronica was waking up. He felt sick just thinking about seeing her again. How could she sleep peacefully knowing what she was doing? Was there any remnant of a conscience in that woman, or was she completely devoid of empathy, a sociopath, seeking only her own interests? Edward forced himself not to go up and confront her. Marcia had been clear. Any impulsive act could jeopardize the case. He had to control himself, no matter how difficult it was. His cell phone rang. It was Marcia. Edward answered immediately. The lawyer's voice sounded tense. "Edward, we've arrived at the clinic. The situation is worse than we imagined. They're refusing to let us see Isabel. They claim visitation needs to be scheduled in advance and authorized by the legal guardian, in this case Veronica. I have a court officer with me, but he says that without a specific warrant for search and seizure, he can't force entry." Edward felt rage explode. "That's kidnapping. My daughter is being held against her will based on false reports." Marcia tried to calm him. "I know, Edward, but we have to do this the right way. I'm filing for a search and seizure warrant right now. With the documentation we have, plus the school's testimony confirming Isabel was healthy, I can get an emergency injunction today. But you need to give me a few hours." Edward reluctantly agreed. Every hour Isabel spent in that clinic was torture for him, but he understood that acting rashly could make things worse. While Marcia worked on the legal aspect, he decided to do some investigating of his own. He called some of his contacts in the business world, people with access to privileged information. He asked them to investigate the Renaissance Clinic. Who were the owners? What were their connections? Was there a history of irregularities? In less than an hour, he began to receive answers, and what he discovered alarmed him even more. The Renaissance Clinic was owned by a business group controlled by people connected to the judicial and political system. One of the majority partners was none other than Brian Thorne, the brother of Judge Henry Foster, the same judge who had signed Isabel's commitment order. Another partner was a former city health commissioner who had been removed from office years ago on suspicion of corruption but never formally charged. The clinic had a history of controversial commitments but always managed to evade investigation. There were complaints from families alleging that patients were kept hospitalized unnecessarily to generate more revenue. But these complaints never resulted in concrete legal action. The clinic had excellent lawyers and, apparently, political protection. Edward then understood the scale of the problem. He wasn't just fighting Veronica. He was fighting an established network of corruption with deep connections in the judiciary and politics. Veronica had chosen her allies carefully. She knew that to maintain such an elaborate sham, she would need institutional support, and she had found the perfect partners for her scheme in the Renaissance Clinic and its connections. Edward needed something stronger than just lawsuits. He needed public exposure. He needed the media to turn the tide. He called Brenda Alcott. The journalist answered on the second ring. "Brenda, I need your help. I need you to publish everything you know about Veronica, and I need you to investigate the Renaissance Clinic and its connections to the judiciary. If we can create a public scandal, they will be forced to back down." Brenda hesitated. "Mr. Morrison, publishing something like this without absolutely solid proof could result in lawsuits against me and the newspaper. I need more than rumors and coincidences. I need documents, witnesses willing to speak publicly, concrete proof of fraud." Edward understood. He asked what would be necessary. Brenda explained that she needed copies of the false medical reports, witnesses who could attest that Isabel was healthy, documentation of the financial connections between Veronica and the clinic, and ideally some recording or document showing Veronica confessing or discussing the scheme. A recording. Edward remembered the conversation with Veronica the previous morning. He hadn't recorded it, but maybe he could provoke a new conversation and this time record everything. Marcia had given him a discreet digital recorder precisely for this kind of situation. Edward told Brenda he would get what she needed. The journalist warned him to be careful. If Veronica discovered she was being recorded, she might simply stop talking, or worse, accelerate her plans to consolidate control over his assets. Edward thanked her for the warning and hung up. He went up the stairs slowly, mentally preparing for what he had to do. He found Veronica in the bedroom, wearing a yoga outfit, as if preparing for a normal, routine day. She looked at him with that serene expression that irritated him deeply. "Good morning, Edward. Did you manage to sleep?" The question was laden with cynicism. She knew perfectly well he hadn't slept. Edward entered the room and closed the door. The recorder was in his shirt. Pocket turned on. He needed to make Veronica talk, reveal her plans, admit what she was doing. He started with a different tactic. Instead of accusations, he adopted a tone of defeat. "Veronica, I get it. You've won. I have no way to fight all of this. The reports, the court orders, the doctors. I just want my daughter back. Tell me what you want." Veronica studied him for a moment, as if assessing whether this was genuine or a trap. Finally, she smiled. "Edward, I always knew you were an intelligent man, and intelligent men know when to negotiate instead of fight." She sat on the bed and crossed her legs elegantly. "What I want is very simple. I want you to transfer 50% of MedTech Solutions shares to my name. I want you to sign over full custody of Isabel to me, with a supervised visitation clause for you. And I want you to maintain a public appearance that we are a happy couple. In return, Isabel is discharged from the clinic and comes home. You can have a relatively normal life, as long as you don't interfere with my decisions." Edward felt his blood boil, but he kept his expression neutral. "And if I agree to this, how do I know you'll keep your end of the bargain?" Veronica laughed softly. "You don't. But this is your only option. The alternative is Isabel remaining committed indefinitely, you losing everything in court and still being prosecuted for parental neglect. Your reputation would be destroyed. Your company would be affected. Your international partners would lose confidence in you. Think carefully, Edward. What's more important, your pride or your daughter's well-being?" Edward pretended to consider. He needed her to say more, to reveal more details of the plan. "And what happens after? After I sign everything?" Veronica stood up and walked to the window. "After we live our lives. I take real control of the company. You continue as the nominal CEO, but with no real decision-making power. Isabel grows up under my guidance, gets the best education, the best of everything. And you, Edward, you learn to live with your choices." Edward took a step towards her. "And the doctors? The clinic? Are they part of your scheme?" Veronica turned to him, still smiling. "Edward, do you really think an operation like this happens on its own? Of course I have partners. The Renaissance Clinic is perfect for this kind of situation. They understand that sometimes commitments are necessary for reasons that go beyond health, and they are very well compensated for their discretion. Just as Judge Foster is compensated for his speed in signing orders, it's a system that has worked perfectly for years." Edward felt a mix of victory and disgust. She was admitting everything, but with such confidence, such certainty, that he had no way to use it against her. "And how many times have you done this? How many families have you destroyed?" Veronica tilted her head, as if genuinely reflecting on the question. "It's not destruction, Edward. It's a redistribution of resources. Men like you, like Robert, like the others, you have so much more than you need. And you're emotionally vulnerable, easy to manipulate. Why not take advantage of that? I work hard, develop a careful plan, execute it perfectly. I deserve to be rewarded." Edward had to struggle not to lunge at her. The coldness with which Veronica spoke about destroying lives was terrifying. She truly had no conscience. She saw people as mere resources to be exploited. He tried. "One last question. And if I refuse? If I decide to fight even knowing I might lose?" Veronica sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Then Isabel suffers the consequences. You need to understand, Edward, that as long as she's under medical care, I can justify any treatment. Heavy medication, invasive therapies, prolonged isolation. All in the name of her health, of course. And the longer she spends there, the harder it will be to prove she was healthy before. The doctors will create a medical history so convincing that no judge will question it." Edward felt like he was going to be sick. She was threatening to harm Isabel, her own stepdaughter, a defenseless child, just to force him to yield. He left the room without another word. He needed to get out of there before he did something impulsive. He went down the stairs quickly and back to the office. With trembling hands, he stopped the recording and immediately sent the file to Marcia and Brenda. This was gold. It was Veronica's full confession. She had admitted to the manipulation, the corruption of doctors and judges, the threats against Isabel. Even if she tried to claim she was just joking or testing Edward, that recording was devastating. A few minutes later, his phone rang. It was Marcia, her voice agitated in a way Edward had never heard before. "Edward, this is incredible. With this recording, we can not only get Isabel out of the clinic, but we can also prosecute Veronica criminally. And more, we can use this to investigate the Renaissance Clinic and Judge Foster. This is much bigger than we imagined. I'm filing a complaint with the Judicial Conduct Commission and the District Attorney's Office right now." Edward felt a wave of relief and hope. Finally, he had something concrete against Veronica. But Marcia warned him, "Edward, we can't underestimate her reaction. When she finds out we have this recording, she's going to counterattack with everything she has. We need to act very quickly before she has a chance to defend herself or do something drastic to Isabel." Edward agreed. Marcia said she was coordinating a joint operation with the DA's office. They were going to retrieve not only Isabel, but also seize all the clinic's documents, arrest those responsible, and expose the entire corruption network. But it would take a few hours to organize. Edward needed to keep Veronica distracted. Without her suspecting she had been recorded, Edward said he would do his best. As he hung up, his phone beeped. It was a message from Brenda. She had received the recording and was writing the story. It would be published on the newspaper's website in a few hours. The provisional headline was revealing, "Fraudulent Commitment Scheme Involves Doctors, Judge, and Socialite." Brenda said she was coordinating with her editor to give the story maximum visibility. It would be the top headline. Edward felt that things were finally starting to move in the right direction. Brenda's article was published at 2 in the afternoon. Within minutes, it began to spread through social media like wildfire. The headline immediately grabbed attention, and the content was even more explosive. Brenda had done an exceptional job, bringing together not only the recording of Veronica, but also documentation on Robert Fisher's case, information about the Renaissance Clinic and its political connections, and had even managed to get anonymous statements from former clinic employees who confirmed the practice of keeping patients committed unnecessarily. It was a complete, devastating report that exposed the entire scheme. Edward followed the reaction on his computer. The comments started pouring in by the thousands. Some expressed shock and outrage. Others shared similar stories that had happened to people they knew. Social media influencers began to talk about the case. Television news channels started covering the story. In less than 2 hours, Veronica Seller's name was among the top trending topics in the country, and along with it, the names of Dr. Arnold Campos, Dr. Philip Moore, and Judge Henry Foster. Marcia called, her voice showing restrained satisfaction. "Edward, the public pressure is working. The court has already opened a preliminary investigation into Judge Foster. The district attorney's office is issuing search warrants for the Renaissance Clinic. And most importantly, I got an injunction ordering Isabel to be immediately transferred to a public hospital, where she will undergo an independent medical evaluation. The operation will happen in a few hours." Edward felt tears of relief welling up in his eyes. Finally, after more than 24 hours of nightmare, his daughter would be safe. Marcia continued, "But Edward, Veronica doesn't know about the recording yet. When she finds out and when she realizes the situation is slipping from her control, we don't know how she'll react. I suggest you don't stay alone with her, and if possible, leave the house until the situation stabilizes." Edward agreed, but before he could leave, he heard the front door open violently. Hurried footsteps in the hall. Veronica stormed into the office like a hurricane holding a tablet. Her face, normally serene and controlled, was red with anger. Her eyes blazed with hatred. She threw the tablet onto Edward's desk. "What did you do? Did you record me?" Edward remained calm, though he felt his heart pound. "I did what was necessary to protect my daughter." Veronica slammed her fist on the desk, making the objects on it tremble. "You have no idea what you've just done. You have no idea of the consequences." Edward stood up, keeping the desk between them. "The consequences are for you, Veronica. You're going to answer for everything you've done. To Isabel, to Robert, to all the other victims." Veronica laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was a bitter, venomous laugh. "Do you really think this will end well for you?" That you'll get your daughter back and return to your perfect life. Edward, you're more naive than I thought. She began to pace back and forth like a caged animal. You've just declared war on very powerful people. Judge Foster has connections that go beyond what you can imagine. The Renaissance Clinic is protected by people in the highest echelons of the state government. Do you really think one news article is going to bring all that down? Edward replied firmly. It's not just an article. It's a full investigation. The DA's office is involved. The Judicial Conduct Commission is investigating the judge. And you, Veronica, you will answer criminally for everything. Veronica stopped pacing and stared at him. Her face had returned to that calm expression, but now Edward recognized what it really was. It wasn't serenity. It was absolute coldness. Fine, Edward. You want to play this game? Let's play. She picked up the tablet and began typing rapidly. In a few seconds, she turned the screen towards Edward. It was a news story from a gossip website. The headline read, "Billionaire businessman accused of assaulting stepdaughter." Edward felt his blood run cold. He began to read. The article, clearly planted by Veronica or her allies, claimed that sources close to the Morrison family had revealed that Edward had aggressive behaviors towards Isabel, that the girl had been seen with bruises, that Veronica had tried to protect the child, but was stopped by her husband. There were even photos, obviously manipulated, showing what were supposedly marks on Isabel's body. Edward felt nauseous. This was an absurd lie, but he knew how public opinion worked. Many people would believe it, at least until the truth was fully clarified. And even then, there would always be those who doubted. Veronica smiled as she saw the look of horror on his face. See how easy it is to destroy a reputation? I have friends in various media outlets. I can plant stories, create narratives, make you look like the villain of this story. And you know what's most interesting? Even when your innocence is proven, there will always be that shadow of doubt. People will always remember. Was he really innocent? Was there something more to it? Edward advanced towards her, his voice low but laden with threat. You will not get away with this. Veronica didn't flinch. Maybe not. But neither will you. And in the meantime, your daughter is still far from you. At that moment, Edward's phone rang. It was Marcia. He answered without taking his eyes off Veronica. The lawyer's voice was tense. Edward, we have a problem. The operation to get Isabel has been postponed. There was a judicial interference. An appellate judge, at the request of the clinic's defense, granted an injunction suspending all actions until a justification hearing is held. Edward felt the floor give way. How was this possible? How, with all the public exposure, with all the evidence, were there still judges protecting this scheme? Marcia explained that the appellate judge was known for his questionable political connections. He was probably also part of the corruption network. She said she was filing appeals, but it would take time, possibly a few more days. Edward hung up, feeling completely defeated. Veronica watched it all with that triumphant smile. See, you have no power, Edward. Not against the system we've built. You may have money, you may have connections, but we have something more important. We have the power to manipulate the institutions, to make judges dance to our tune, to make the truth whatever we decide it is. Edward sat down heavily in his chair. All the adrenaline, all the determination he had felt minutes ago seemed to have evaporated. Veronica took the opportunity to continue her attack. And now, with these accusations of assault against you, even if you can prove they're false, your credibility is tarnished. When there's finally a hearing about Isabel's custody, what do you think a judge will think? They'll think maybe it's not safe to leave the girl with you. They'll think that maybe Veronica, the poor stepmother who was trying to protect the child, is the better option. Edward felt a rage so intense he had to hold himself back from doing something he would regret. But deep down, a part of him knew Veronica was right about one thing. She had built a web so complex with so many layers of protection that destroying it would be extremely difficult. But he couldn't give up. Not while Isabel was in danger. He looked at Veronica and said with all the conviction he could muster, "You will pay for all of this. I don't know how, I don't know when, but you will pay." Veronica simply shrugged. "Maybe. But for now, you're the one who's paying." With those words, she left the office, leaving Edward alone, with his impotence and anger. He immediately called Brenda. He needed her to investigate the appellate judge who had granted the injunction. He needed to expose the entire network of corruption, every judge, every doctor, every person involved in that scheme. Brenda said she was already working on it, that she had received several anonymous tips after the first article, that she was assembling a complete dossier. But she warned that publishing accusations against an appellate judge required even more solid proof. One false step could result in judicial censorship, in multi-million-dollar lawsuits. Edward said he would get the proof, even if it meant hiring private investigators, hackers, whatever it took. Brenda agreed to continue working, but asked him to be careful. People involved in judicial corruption didn't hesitate to use violent methods when they felt threatened. Edward spent the next few hours making calls. He called renowned private investigators, explained the situation, and asked them to investigate everyone involved. He called his contacts in the business world, asked for support, asked them to use their influence to pressure the authorities. He called human rights organizations, lawyers specializing in judicial corruption cases, and investigative journalists. He was building an army of allies, people willing to help him bring down Veronica and the entire network that protected her. And as he did so, he received constant updates from Marcia about the ongoing legal proceedings. The situation was complex. On one hand, the public exposure was working. There were protests on social media demanding justice for Isabel. Some authorities, feeling the public pressure, were beginning to take a stand. The governor had announced he would order a full audit of all psychiatric clinics in the state. The regional medical board had opened an investigation into the doctors at the Renaissance Clinic. But on the other hand, the judicial machine moved slowly. The injunctions, the appeals, the postponed hearings, everything conspired to keep Isabel away from Edward for longer. And every day that passed was torture. He didn't know how she was being treated, if she was scared, if they understood she wasn't sick. The mere possibility that they were medicating her unnecessarily caused Edward physical anguish. That evening he received an unexpected call. It was Robert Fisher, Veronica's ex-husband. Edward recognized the name immediately from the documents Brenda had shown him. Robert said he had seen the news, learned about Edward's case, and wanted to offer any help he could. He said he understood perfectly what Edward was going through because he had been through the same thing. And he warned that Veronica was relentless. She would not give up easily. Even with all the exposure, even with the investigations, she would continue to fight until the end. Edward thanked him and asked about Matthew, Robert's son. How was he now after 4 years in a clinic? Robert hesitated before answering, his voice thick with emotion. He's different, Edward. He went through unnecessary treatments, heavy medications, therapies he didn't need. Even after, I managed to get him out of the clinic a year ago. He's still recovering. He has nightmares, anxiety, difficulty trusting people. Veronica destroyed part of his childhood. So I'm begging you, do everything in your power to get Isabel out of there as quickly as possible. Every day counts. Edward felt tears stream down his face. He promised Robert he would fight to the end, and he asked if Robert would be willing to testify publicly against Veronica, to tell his story in detail. Robert agreed immediately. He said he had been waiting for this opportunity for years, that he would finally see Veronica held accountable for her crimes. Edward hung up and sat in the dark office for a long time. He thought of Isabel, alone in some room in that cursed clinic. He thought of how confused and scared she must be, feeling abandoned by her father. He had promised to get her, had said he would fix everything, but he was failing. With every hour that passed without being able to get her out, he was failing. The guilt was almost unbearable, but mixed with the guilt was something else, determination, anger, a visceral need to protect his daughter and to completely destroy Veronica and everyone who helped her. Edward was not a vengeful person by nature. He had always preferred to resolve conflicts in a civilized manner, through negotiations and agreements. But this was different. This was personal. This involved his daughter, and for her he was willing to cross any line, to use any method available. He opened his laptop and began to write an email to all his press contacts. He was going to give interviews. He was going to tell his side of the story publicly. He would use his position, his visibility, to ensure that Isabel's case was not forgotten, that public pressure continued to grow until the authorities had no choice but to act. In the email, he offered himself for exclusive interviews, for television shows, for any platform that wanted to hear his story, and he attached Veronica's recording, the documents about Robert's case, all the evidence he had gathered. Within minutes, he began to receive replies, producers of news programs wanting to book him, journalists asking for interviews. The story was spreading further and further, gaining national proportions. Around midnight, Marcia called again. She had received an offer. Veronica's lawyers wanted to negotiate. They were proposing a deal. Veronica would return full custody of Isabel to Edward, nullify all powers of attorney, and divorce him without asking for a division of assets. In return, Edward would drop all charges, not prosecute Veronica criminally, and sign a confidentiality agreement about everything he had discovered. Edward felt immediate anger. This was Veronica's attempt to escape the consequences. Marcia agreed, but said they needed to consider it carefully. A deal would ensure Isabel returned immediately. It would avoid months, perhaps years of legal battles. It would protect the girl from having to testify, from being publicly exposed, from continuing to be used as a pawn in this perverse game. Edward was silent for a long moment. The rational part of him understood Marcia's argument. The most important thing was Isabel. If a deal guaranteed she would come home immediately, perhaps it was worth swallowing his pride, swallowing his anger and accepting, but the emotional part of him completely rejected the idea. Accepting the deal would mean Veronica would go unpunished. It would mean she could do the same thing to other victims in the future. It would mean the corrupt system that protected her would continue to operate. He asked Marcia for her recommendation. The lawyer sighed. "Edward, as your lawyer, I must recommend the deal. It's the safest, fastest, and least traumatic path for Isabel. But as your friend, I have to say I understand if you want to refuse. Veronica deserves to be punished. The system that allows people like her to operate deserves to be exposed and destroyed. It's a decision only you can make." Edward thought of Isabel. He thought of her face being led away by the police. He thought of the fear in her eyes. He thought of how she must be feeling at that moment, alone, confused, probably believing her father had abandoned her. And then he thought of Robert and Matthew. He thought of all the other victims of Veronica who never had the chance to fight back. He thought of all the families that had been destroyed by that corruption scheme. And he made his decision. "Refuse the deal, Marcia. We're going all the way. We're going to expose everything. We're going to sue everyone involved. We're going to make sure Veronica pays for every crime she's committed. Even if it takes longer, even if it's harder, I won't let her get away." Marcia was silent for a moment. Then she said, with a touch of admiration in her voice, "Understood. I'll inform her lawyers that the proposal has been rejected, and I'll prepare the heavy artillery. If it's a war she wants, it's a war she'll get." Edward hung up and finally allowed himself a moment of weakness. He rested his head on the desk and cried, releasing all the tension, all the fear, all the anger he had accumulated over the past hours. He cried for Isabel, for himself, for the impossible situation they had been placed in. But when he lifted his head again, there was only determination in his eyes. The battle was just beginning. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of frantic activity. Edward barely slept, barely ate. Every moment of his life dedicated to the fight to get Isabel back and destroy Veronica. He gave interviews to the country's major television channels, sitting on the sofas of impeccable studios, under bright lights and before attentive cameras. He told his story in emotional detail. He spoke about how Veronica had infiltrated his life, how she had manipulated documents, how she had kidnapped his daughter under false medical pretenses. He spoke about Robert Fisher and his son Matthew, about the criminal pattern Veronica followed. And always, in every interview, he played the recording. That cold, calculated confession of Veronica, admitting to the entire plot. The reaction was immediate and massive. Social media exploded. Hashtags like "Justice for Isabel" and "Arrest Veronica Sellers" became trending topics, not just in the United States, but internationally. Celebrities began to speak out, demanding justice. Child protection organizations issued statements of condemnation. The pressure on the authorities became unbearable. The state's attorney's office announced the creation of a special task force to investigate not only Isabel's case, but the entire network of corruption involving the Renaissance Clinic, Judge Henry Foster, and others involved. The appellate judge, who had granted the injunction protecting the clinic, was preemptively suspended while being investigated by the Judicial Conduct Commission. It was a significant step forward, but it still wasn't enough. Isabel was still committed. Marcia worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She had managed to mobilize a team of volunteer lawyers, experts in family law and judicial corruption cases. Together, they filed a barrage of legal actions, a writ of habeas corpus for Isabel, complaints against Veronica, against the clinic's doctors, against Judge Foster, petitions to nullify the fraudulent power of attorney, a divorce lawsuit with a claim for emotional damages. It was a saturation strategy, attacking on all possible fronts simultaneously, giving Veronica and her allies no time to organize a cohesive defense. And slowly, it began to work. Honest judges, feeling the public pressure and aware that the case was being closely watched by the media, began to rule in Edward's favor. On the third day, there was a crucial turning point. One of the private investigators hired by Edward achieved something extraordinary. He had traced Veronica's financial movements over the past 5 years and discovered a clear pattern. Large bank transfers always following cases of commitment, always to offshore accounts in tax havens, always split with the same beneficiaries. Among these beneficiaries were Dr. Arnold Campos, director of the Renaissance Clinic, Judge Henry Foster, and other people connected to the judicial and medical systems. It was the definitive proof of the corruption scheme. Traceable, documented money impossible to deny. Edward handed all the documentation to the district attorney's office and to Brenda, who published a second article, even more devastating than the first. The reaction was immediate. Judge Henry Foster was formally charged with accepting bribes and had a warrant issued for his arrest. He was arrested by federal agents at his own home, in handcuffs, under the flash of dozens of cameras. The images circulated throughout the country. A magistrate, someone who should represent law and justice, being led away like a common criminal. It was a powerful symbolic moment. Dr. Arnold Campos was also arrested, as was Dr. Philip Moore. The Renaissance Clinic had its operations suspended by court order and was raided by teams from the DA's office, who seized computers, documents, and medical records. What they found was shocking. Dozens of cases of questionable commitments. Children and adolescents kept committed for months, years, without real medical justification. Families destroyed, fortunes diverted, lives ruined. The Renaissance Clinic was much more than an accomplice to Veronica. It was the center of a criminal operation of terrifying proportions. And Veronica. She disappeared. On the morning of the third day, when Edward woke up, he realized the house was too quiet. He went up to the room Veronica had occupied and found it empty. Clothes gone. Jewelry missing. Personal documents taken. She had fled during the night, likely realizing the walls were closing in around her. Edward immediately informed Marcia, who in turn alerted the authorities. An arrest warrant was issued for Veronica Sellers for aggravated kidnapping, document forgery, racketeering, and several other crimes. Her face was broadcast on all media outlets, wanted by the law. But she seemed to have vanished completely. No one knew where she was. Veronica's absence, ironically, made things easier for Edward. Without her direct influence, without her constant manipulations, the judicial system began to function more efficiently. On the fourth day, after the public exposure of the case began, the decision Edward had been waiting for finally arrived. A federal judge taking over the case due to the connections with judicial corruption ordered the immediate release of Isabel from the Renaissance Clinic and her transfer to Edward's temporary custody, pending the final outcome of the proceedings. Marcia called Edward with the news, her voice emotional. "Edward, it's today. We're going to get Isabel." Edward felt his legs weaken. After days of anguish, fear, and uncertainty, he could finally hug his daughter again. He and Marcia went to the clinic accompanied by a team from the district attorney's office, and a convoy of journalists. Edward had insisted the press be present. He wanted everything documented, so there would be no doubt about how things happened. When they arrived at the Renaissance Clinic, they found a desolate scene. The building, which looked elegant and modern from the outside, had a sinister air. Bars on the windows, excessive security. It looked more like a prison than a medical treatment facility. Edward felt sick, thinking his daughter had spent days inside. The DA's team presented the court order to the clinic's administration, which was now being managed by government-appointed receivers. There was some initial bureaucratic resistance, but faced with the presence of the press and the determination of the prosecutors, they quickly yielded. Edward was led through cold, impersonal corridors. The smell of disinfectant was strong, almost suffocating. They passed locked doors, rooms where other children could be seen through small windows, children with empty eyes, over-medicated, deprived of their childhood. Edward felt renewed anger. How many Isabels were there? How many children were being held prisoner under the pretext of treatment? Finally, they arrived at a door numbered 317, a clinic. Employee opened the door and Edward went in. The room was small, Spartan. A hospital bed, a small table, a chair, no toys, no books, nothing a child would need to feel comfortable. And there, sitting on the bed, wearing a light blue hospital gown, was Isabel. The girl looked up when the door opened. When she saw Edward, her face first showed confusion, as if she wasn't sure he was real. Then recognition, and finally, an explosion of emotion. "Daddy!" She jumped off the bed and ran towards him. Edward knelt and hugged her with all his might, as if to protect her from all the evil in the world. Isabel was sobbing convulsively, clinging to him. "I knew you would come, Daddy. I knew it. They said you had abandoned me, but I knew it was a lie." Edward was crying too, without shame, without embarrassment. "Never, my daughter. I will never abandon you. Daddy's here. Everything's okay now. Everything's okay." They remained in an embrace for a long time, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the people around them. It was a moment just for them, a moment of reconnection, of relief, of pure and unconditional love. When they finally separated, Edward examined Isabel. She was thinner, paler. There were dark circles under her eyes, but physically she seemed to be okay. He asked if she was hurt, if anyone had harmed her. Isabel shook her head. "They just gave me medicine, Daddy. Medicine that made me sleep all the time. And they asked strange questions, trying to make me say bad things about you. But I didn't say anything. I said, 'You're the best dad in the world.'" Edward felt both pride and sadness. His little girl had been strong, stronger than any child should ever have to be. He promised her that nothing like this would ever happen again, that he had learned his lesson, that he would be more careful, more protective. The independent medical team accompanying the operation conducted a quick evaluation of Isabel on the spot. They confirmed she was physically healthy, although she showed signs of emotional stress and the effects of unnecessary medication. They recommended psychological counseling to deal with the trauma, but assured him that with proper support, she would make a full recovery. Edward thanked them profusely and held Isabel's hand firmly. They left the clinic together, father and daughter, finally reunited. Outside there was a crowd, journalists, onlookers, supporters who had followed the case in the media. When they saw Edward leaving with Isabel, they began to applaud. It was a surreal moment. Edward, who had always been a private person, who had always avoided unnecessary exposure, was now at the center of a national scandal. But he didn't care. He had his daughter back. That was all that mattered. Back at the mansion, Edward took immediate steps to make Isabel feel safe. He hired private security to monitor the property. He installed additional security cameras. He changed all the locks. Veronica was still a fugitive, and as long as she was free, there was a risk, however small, that she might try something. Edward would not give her any opportunity. He also hired a child psychologist, specializing in trauma, to work with Isabel. Dr. Helen Sawyer was a renowned professional with decades of experience. She began seeing Isabel daily, helping the girl process everything that had happened, to separate reality from manipulation, to rebuild her sense of safety and normality. The following days were about adjustment. Isabel returned to school, where she was welcomed with affection by her classmates and teachers. Miss Andrews made sure to create a welcoming environment without invasive questions, allowing Isabel to resume her routine at her own pace. Edward drastically reduced his professional commitments. He delegated the daily management of medtech solutions to his trusted team and began working from home, ensuring he would always be available for Isabel. They spent the afternoons together, talking, playing, simply being in each other's presence. Slowly, the girl began to be herself again. The laughter returned, the sparkle in her eyes returned, the confidence returned. But Edward knew the battle was not completely over. Veronica was still on the run. There were rumors that she had fled abroad, perhaps to a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. Interpol had been alerted, but finding her would be difficult if she was determined to stay hidden. Edward regularly attended meetings with the district attorney's office, offering any information that could help locate her, and at the same time he dealt with the pending legal issues. The divorce was being processed. The nullification of the fraudulent power of attorney had been granted. He was regaining full control of his assets, although some transactions made by Veronica were still being investigated and reversed. 2 weeks after Isabel's release, there was unexpected news. Veronica had been located. She was in a luxury hotel in Cancun, Mexico, trying to live discreetly with false documents, but her image was too recognizable. A hotel guest recognized her and alerted the Mexican authorities, who in turn contacted Interpol. Veronica was arrested without resistance, and the extradition process began immediately. Edward felt a deep satisfaction upon hearing this. Finally, Veronica would face justice. There would be no more manipulations, no more escapes. She would answer for every crime she had committed. Marcia called to give him the news and to add another important piece of information. With Veronica's arrest and the evidence collected by the task force, other cases were coming to light. Other victims, encouraged by the exposure of the scheme, were beginning to come forward. Men who had been ruined by Veronica in previous years, who had never had the courage or resources to fight, were now uniting to ensure she paid for everything. Robert Fisher was one of those voices. He gave an emotional interview alongside Matthew, now 13, talking about the 4 years of suffering, about the struggle to get his son back, about the trauma they were still overcoming. The interview had millions of views and brought even more attention to the case. The entire country was watching. It was more than an individual case. It had become a symbol of the fight against corruption, against the manipulation of institutions that should protect the most vulnerable. Edward never imagined his personal tragedy would become something so much larger, but if it meant that other families would be protected in the future, that the system would be reformed, then it was worth it. One evening, while Isabel slept peacefully, in her room, Edward sat in his office and reflected on everything that had happened. In a matter of weeks, his life had been turned upside down. He had discovered that the woman he trusted was a criminal. He had seen his daughter torn from his arms. He had fought against a corrupt system that seemed insurmountable. He had exposed his private life to the entire country. And through it all, he had discovered strengths he never knew he possessed. He had discovered that when it came to protecting those he loved, he was capable of going to the limits. But he had also learned a hard lesson about trust, about vulnerability, about how pain and loneliness could make a person susceptible to manipulation. He no longer blamed himself as he had at the beginning. Veronica was an experienced predator, but he promised himself he would never be naive again, never allow anyone to get close to Isabel without a thorough check of their background and intentions. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Brenda. The journalist informed him that the full story, an investigative special on Veronica and the entire corruption network, would be published the following Sunday. It would be an extensive feature, with interviews, documents, and analysis. Brenda said this work was the most important of her career, and she thanked Edward for trusting her. Edward replied, thanking her. Brenda had been crucial. Without her courage to investigate and publish, without her willingness to risk her career to expose the truth, perhaps Veronica would still be operating freely. Perhaps Isabel would still be in the clinic. perhaps Edward would be completely ruined. It was amazing how certain people appeared at crucial moments, how small decisions could have major consequences. If Brenda hadn't decided to investigate, Veronica years ago, if she hadn't seen the news about Isabel and decided to get in touch, everything could have been different. Edward got up and went to Isabel's room. The door was ajar. He pushed it open gently and watched the girl sleep. She seemed peaceful, finally. In the first few days after returning home, Isabel had frequent nightmares. She would wake up crying, scared, asking for confirmation that she was really home, that her father was there. But gradually, with therapy, with routine, with the love and security Edward provided, the nightmares subsided. She was healing. Edward entered the room silently and adjusted the blanket over her. He kissed her forehead gently. Isabel murmured something incomprehensible in her sleep and turned over, hugging her favorite teddy bear. Edward smiled. There was his reason to fight, his reason to exist. Everything he had been through, all the suffering, all the battle, was worth it for this moment of peace, seeing his daughter safe in her own bed, in her own home. He left the room and returned to the office. There was still much work to be done. The legal proceedings would continue for months, perhaps years. Veronica's extradition would take time. The trial of her and everyone involved in the scheme would be long and complex, but Edward was prepared. He had the best lawyers, he had irrefutable evidence, he had the support of public opinion, and most importantly, he had motivation. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for Isabel, for Robert and Matthew, for all of Veronica's victims, for all the children who had been unjustly held at the Renaissance Clinic, for all the families that had been destroyed by that cruel scheme. It was a fight that went far beyond his personal situation. It was a fight for justice, for truth, for a better system, and Edward was determined to win. 6 months had passed since the day Isabel was rescued from the Renaissance Clinic. Autumn had arrived in Chicago, bringing with it cooler days and a sense of renewal that Edward felt deeply. Life had found a new rhythm, a new balance. Isabel was radiant, completely recovered from the trauma she had suffered. Her therapy with Dr. Helen continued, but now the sessions were weekly, no longer daily. The girl had returned to being the cheerful, communicative child Edward had always known. Her eyes sparkled again when she talked about her day at school, when she showed him the drawings she had made, when she simply ran through the mansion's garden playing with the dog Edward had given her as a recovery gift. A golden retriever named Apollo, who had become Isabel's inseparable companion. Edward had changed too. The experience had completely transformed his perspective on what truly mattered in life. Before, he was obsessed with work, with expanding his business empire, with closing ever larger deals. Now, although he still managed MedTech solutions competently, his real commitments were to Isabel. He took her to school every morning, picked her up in the late afternoon. They had dinner together every night, talking about everything and nothing. On weekends, they did activities an 8-year-old would love. Amusement parks, movies, picnics, interactive museums. Edward was making up for lost time, the years when he was physically present but emotionally distant, always with his head in business. He would never make that mistake again. Isabel had only one childhood, and he was determined to ensure it was happy and safe. The house had changed too. Edward had hired a decorator to renovate all the rooms, especially Isabel's. He wanted to erase any trace of Veronica's presence. New furniture, new colors, new energy. The room Veronica had occupied was transformed into a library, a cozy space with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, comfortable armchairs, and large windows that filled the room with natural light. Edward spent hours there reading, studying, preparing for the legal proceedings that were still ongoing. Because although life had found some normality, the legal battle continued. And finally, after months of bureaucratic and diplomatic procedures, the decisive moment had arrived. Veronica had been extradited from Mexico and was now awaiting trial in a women's prison in Chicago. The trial was scheduled to begin on a Monday in May. Edward woke up that day with a mix of anxiety and determination. Isabel, sensing her father's tension, hugged him during breakfast. "Everything will be okay, Daddy. You're the strongest person in the world." Edward smiled. moved by the role reversal. His little girl, who had suffered so much, was now comforting him. He hugged her back and promised that, yes, everything would be okay. Walter drove them to the criminal courthouse, where a crowd was already gathering. Journalists, onlookers, supporters, everyone wanted to witness this historic moment. The case of Veronica Sellers had become one of the most emblematic in the country, a symbol of the fight against corruption and systemic manipulation. Edward entered the courthouse, accompanied by Marcia and his team of lawyers. Isabel had stayed at home, under the care of Dr. Helen. It was important to protect her from all the exposure. The courtroom was packed. Edward spotted Robert Fisher, who was sitting a few rows back. The two exchanged a nod. Robert would also be a witness, telling his own story with Veronica. Other ex-husbands and partners of Veronica were also present. Over the months of investigation, they had discovered that her history was even more extensive than they had imagined. At least 7 different men over 15 years had been victims of her schemes. Not all had survived financially or emotionally what she had done. When Veronica was brought into the room, escorted by bailiffs, a heavy silence fell over the room. She wore an orange prison jumpsuit, and her blonde hair, once always impeccable, was tied in a simple ponytail. But what was most striking was her expression. There was no remorse there, no guilt, just the same coldness that Edward knew so well. She looked around the room, her eyes briefly stopping on Edward. There was no emotion in that gaze. It was as if she were observing an inanimate object. Edward held her gaze, refusing to show any weakness. Veronica finally looked away and sat down next to her lawyers. The judge presiding over the case was Judge Oswald Marshall, a magistrate known for his integrity and rigor. He had been specifically chosen because he had no connection to the circles in which Veronica operated. He was someone who could be trusted to conduct a fair trial. The prosecutor, Frank Lopez, a middle-aged man with a reputation for being relentless with white-collar criminals, opened the trial by presenting a summary of the charges. The list was extensive: aggravated kidnapping, document forgery, racketeering, fraud, bribery, psychological torture. Each charge was supported by voluminous evidence: documents, recordings, testimonies, financial transactions. It was a solid, practically irrefutable case. Over the following days, the trial unfolded methodically. Witnesses were called one after another. Doctors from the Renaissance Clinic, who had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for reduced sentences, testified about how the scheme worked, how Veronica approached them with lucrative proposals, how they falsified medical reports, how they kept children committed unnecessarily, sedated, isolated, while their parents were manipulated and extorted. The testimonies were shocking, revealing a level of cruelty and premeditation that horrified everyone in the room. Robert Fisher took the witness stand and told his story with a trembling voice. He spoke about how Veronica had destroyed his family, how his son Matthew still suffered from the consequences of the time he spent unjustly committed. He spoke about the years of struggle to try to recover what he had lost, about the feeling of helplessness in the face of a system that seemed to protect the criminal. When it was Edward's turn to testify, he stood up with determination. He looked directly at Veronica as he swore to tell the truth. She maintained that impassive expression, but Edward knew that behind that mask was calculation, was anger at having finally been caught. He told everything. From his first meeting with Veronica, through the marriage, the gradual manipulation, the trip she used to execute her plan. He spoke about the devastating moment he returned home to find Isabel being led away in handcuffs, about the days of anguish not knowing if he would get his daughter back, about the fear that Isabel would be permanently harmed by unnecessary treatments. His voice broke at times, emotion overflowing, but he continued, ensuring that every detail was recorded, that everyone understood the magnitude of what Veronica had done. When the prosecutor presented the recording where Veronica confessed to the entire scheme, the reaction in the room was visceral. Murmurs of outrage, expressions of shock. Even Veronica's defense lawyers seemed shaken, realizing there was no way to defend the indefensible. Veronica's own voice, calm and cold, admitting she had manipulated doctors and judges, that she had threatened to harm Isabel to force Edward to yield, that she saw people as resources to be exploited. It was devastating. Veronica's lawyers tried to argue that the recording had been obtained illegally, that Edward had tricked her into talking. But the judge rejected the claim, ruling that the recording was admissible as evidence since it was made in Edward's own residence by himself, in a conversation where Veronica was confessing to crimes. The defense tried other strategies. They claimed Veronica suffered from psychological disorders that diminished her capacity for judgment. They presented reports from psychiatrists stating she had a sociopathic personality, that she couldn't feel empathy, that her actions were the result of a medical condition, but the prosecutor brilliantly counter-argued. He said that even if Veronica had psychological disorders, it did not absolve her of responsibility. Her actions were clearly premeditated, calculated and executed with precision over years. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had chosen her victims carefully, had planned every step, had built a network of accomplices. She was not a person acting on impulse due to a mental illness. She was a conscious and deliberate criminal, and even if she had difficulty with empathy, that didn't make her any less responsible for the consequences of her actions. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of painful testimonies, overwhelming evidence, and complex legal arguments. But finally, the time for the verdict arrived. Judge Oswald Marshall, with his serious expression and firm voice, began to read his decision. He reviewed all the evidence presented, all the charges, all the arguments, and then, methodically, he declared Veronica guilty on each and every charge. Guilty of kidnapping, guilty of forgery, guilty of racketeering, guilty of bribery, guilty of psychological torture. With each word, Edward felt a deep satisfaction. Finally, justice was being served. The judge then announced the sentence. Considering the severity of the crimes, the premeditation, the number of victims, and the absence of any mitigating circumstances, he sentenced Veronica Sellers to 32 years in prison, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 1/3 of the sentence. Furthermore, he ordered the forfeiture of all assets Veronica had acquired through her crimes, assets that would be used to compensate the victims. The courtroom erupted in reaction. Some applauded, others cried with relief. Edward simply closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It was done. Veronica would pay for her crimes. She would spend decades behind bars. She could never harm anyone again. Robert Fisher stood up from his seat and walked over to Edward. The two men embraced, united by their shared experience, by the victory they had won together. Marcia was also emotional, discreetly wiping tears from her eyes. She had worked tirelessly for this result, and seeing justice served was deeply gratifying. Veronica was led back to prison without showing any emotion. She didn't cry, she didn't protest, she didn't ask for mercy. She simply walked out under escort, as if this were just another temporary inconvenience in her life. Edward knew she would probably never feel genuine remorse. People like Veronica didn't have that capacity, but at least now she could no longer harm anyone. In the days following the trial, there were additional consequences. Judge Henry Foster was also convicted, receiving 15 years for accepting bribes and malfeasance. Dr. Arnold Campos and Dr. Philip Moore each received sentences of 12 years. Other doctors and staff from the Renaissance Clinic who had participated in the scheme were also sentenced to varying terms. The clinic was permanently closed, its assets seized, and its medical records were all reviewed by an independent commission to identify other possible victims. The appellate judge, who had tried to protect the clinic with injunctions, was permanently removed from the bench and also faced criminal charges. It was a complete cleansing of the system that had allowed Veronica to operate for so long. The impact of the case went beyond the individual convictions. The federal government, pressured by public opinion, announced reforms to the system of involuntary commitment. New rules were created to ensure that children could not be committed without evaluation by multiple independent professionals. Broad powers of attorney like the one Edward had signed were more strictly regulated. requiring judicial approval in certain cases. Psychiatric clinics began to be inspected more frequently and rigorously. They weren't perfect changes, and there was still much to be done, but it was a start. It was a positive legacy that emerged from so much pain and suffering. Edward actively participated in these discussions, using his visibility and resources to push for significant reforms. He even created a foundation, the Isabel Foundation, dedicated to supporting families facing situations of judicial manipulation and fraudulent commitments. Over time, life truly returned to normal. Isabel continued to grow, a smart and happy girl. She knew in a way appropriate for her age what had happened. Edward and Dr. Helen had talked to her, explaining that Veronica was a person who did wrong things, but that she was now in prison and could no longer harm anyone. Isabel processed this information with surprising maturity. She told her father she wasn't angry at Veronica, just felt sorry for her, because someone who did so much harm must be a very sad person inside. Edward was impressed by his daughter's wisdom, by her capacity for empathy even after all she had suffered. It confirmed that he was raising an exceptional person who had overcome trauma and emerged stronger. Edward also allowed himself to consider the possibility of eventually starting over in his personal life. Not now, not so soon. The wound was still fresh, and he needed to focus completely on Isabel and her recovery. But someday, perhaps, he could meet someone genuine, someone who truly loved him and Isabel for who they were, not for what they had. But this time, he would be infinitely more careful. He would do thorough background checks. He would take time to get to know the person deeply. He would never again allow someone to get close to Isabel without being absolutely certain of their intentions. The experience with Veronica had made him more cautious, but also wiser. He had learned to value what truly mattered: family, love, trust, integrity. These were the things no money could buy, no contract could guarantee. They were built through consistent actions, genuine presence, daily choices to prioritize what was essential. One Saturday afternoon, 3 months after the trial, Edward and Isabel were in the mansion's garden. Apollo was running between them, chasing a ball. Isabel was laughing with delight, her brown hair flying in the wind. Edward watched the scene and felt a deep gratitude. Gratitude for having been able to save his daughter. Gratitude for having found strengths he never knew he possessed. Gratitude for the people who had helped him on this journey. Marcia with her competence and dedication, Brenda with her journalistic courage, Robert with his solidarity and shared experience, all the anonymous people who had offered support on social media, who had pushed for justice, who had turned an individual case into a movement for systemic change. Isabel ran to him and jumped into his arms. "I love you, Daddy." Edward hugged her tightly, feeling tears well up in his eyes. "I love you too, my daughter, more than anything in this world." They stayed in an embrace for a long moment, father and daughter, united by a love that had been tested to its limit but emerged stronger than ever. Edward knew there would still be challenges ahead. Life always brought challenges, but now he was prepared. He was vigilant, he was determined, and above all he was present in his daughter's life in a way he had never been before. Present to protect her, to guide her, to love her unconditionally. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Edward and Isabel went inside. They had dinner together, talking about their plans for the next day. Isabel wanted to go to the amusement park. Edward agreed immediately. After dinner, he took her to her room and read her favorite story, a tale about a brave princess who faced a dragon. When Isabel fell asleep, Edward stayed there for a few minutes just watching. This girl was his world. She was his reason for being, and he had promised to protect her, and he had fulfilled that promise. He had faced his own dragons in the form of manipulation, corruption, and human evil, and he had won. Not perfectly, not without scars, but he had won. He left the room silently and went to his office. He sat in his chair and looked around. The walls were covered with photos of Isabel at different ages, as a baby, a toddler, as she was now. It was a visual memorial of a life, of a journey, of a father's love. Edward picked up his phone and checked the news. The latest update on Veronica's case indicated that she had appealed the sentence, but legal analysts were unanimous that the appeal would be denied. The evidence was irrefutable. The trial had been conducted impeccably. Veronica would spend decades in prison. It was a just outcome. Edward turned off his phone and stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the moonlit garden. There, in that space, his daughter had run happily just hours before. There they would build happy memories from now on. The nightmare was over. The storm had passed, and now finally they could live in peace with security, with hope. Edward smiled softly. Yes, there was still much work to be done, many smaller battles to be fought. But the main war was won. Isabel was safe. Veronica was in prison. Justice had prevailed, and he, Edward Morrison, had learned lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. About love, about protection, about the importance of being truly present. Lessons that made him not only a better father, but a better human being. And for that, despite all the pain, despite all the suffering, he was grateful. Because in the end, what didn't destroy his family only made it stronger. And together, father and daughter, they would face any challenge the future might bring.